You're watching Stat News Global. I'm Amitabh Devi, and really glad to see again from Colombo this time Ambassador M. Ashraf Haidery. He's, of course, Afghanistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka. He has served as deputy ambassador in India as well as the US, and has also served in the Afghan National Security Agency. Ambassador Haidery, glad to see you again, even though it's only virtually. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure to see you.
Ambassador Haidery, just looking at the decision which is expected now for over a week, with the Trump administration announcing that it's going to halve the number of troops to about 2,500 by the 15th of January. Now, let's not even talk about the appropriateness of transitional administration doing that. But I'm just looking at some reactions. For example, an ex-Supreme Commander of NATO, Admiral Stavridis, who is called it astoundingly foolish, especially since talks are currently on, even if stalled, with the Taliban. What is your reading of why this decision has been taken, Ambassador Haidery?
Well, we have been expecting this drawdown, and it has been in the talks for over 2 years or so, especially since the U.S. Taliban agreement that took place in February, and as well as the joint declaration for bringing peace and prosperity to Afghanistan in the same month, as well as the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2013. So what really matters is the continued support of the United States and as well as the NATO allies that maintain a larger number of forces in Afghanistan, as well as the caliber and quality of the U.S. forces that would remain in Afghanistan, this 2,500 by January, that would continue to stay in Afghanistan, while knowing that, of course, that the Afghan security forces have been carrying out more than 95% of all counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism, and counter-narcotics operations since the withdrawal of NATO U.S. forces
2014
process, yes, at the end of 2014. So we had been expecting this, and we have been preparing, leading, like I said, most of the counter-terrorist operations, but at the same time relying on the continued air power support, training, advising, and support from the Resolute support mission in Afghanistan.
This decision that has been announced, it's Iraq as well. And if you look at the broader contours of policy in this transitional phase of the Trump regime, it seems like they're taking a lot of decisions, extreme, possibly in some measure. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also yesterday, before I think this decision was announced, said that the price for leaving too soon or in an uncoordinated way could be very high. How do you see the timing of this, especially like I'm saying, because the intra-Afghan talks are on, even though they're stalled?
Well, the NATO Secretary General is correct. So are so many U.S. generals and diplomats who have made similar comments on the importance of staying engaged in the course in Afghanistan, so that the right conditions are provided for enabling a results-oriented peace process, one that would give us the kind of dignified and sustainable peace that the Afghan people are looking for, and of course the rest of our own neighborhood, and as well as the rest of the world in the United States, because it is in their long best term interest to stay the course in Afghanistan. And as we know from early 1990s, that the United States would not have to come back sometime down the road, as we witnessed, unfortunately, what unfolded in Afghanistan throughout the 1990s, that culminated to the tragedy of 9/11 that re-engaged the world, led by the United States. So clearly we have made significant progress over the past 19 years in terms of democratic state building and sustainable development, human rights, women's rights, and of course education, higher education, and infrastructure building across Afghanistan, and as well as the initiatives taken by His Excellency President Ghani to ensure connectivity inside and across the region, so that once a peace with the support of the region and our international partners, including the United States, has been restored in Afghanistan, that the whole region and the rest of the international community would benefit from that. So it's not just about Afghanistan, it's not just about the region, but it's just about the whole international community. And that's why we take pride in having served over the past 19 years as the Center for International Security and increasingly economic cooperation. We'd like to continue to that role beyond, of course, reaching a sustainable, dignified peace deal with the Taliban, provided that the Taliban deliver on their commitments. Unfortunately, we've seen that not only they have failed to do so, they have increased and escalated violence across Afghanistan, carrying out daily attacks on innocent civilians, recently killing journalists, unfortunately. And so this is beyond Afghanistan, and one that I think all nations in the region and beyond, including our NATO partners, should continue contributing to.
If I look at a recent made by Michelle Flournoy, who has been tapped or is said to be possibly the next Secretary of Defense in the US, where she talks about the US signaling a long-term commitment to Afghanistan as a partner for fighting terrorism. She also goes on to say if there's any waffling, any sense that we are not fully committed, the Taliban will continue to wait us out. Now, you've had considerable experience in Washington, D.C. among the corridors of power there when Biden was a senator. You've interacted with his advisors. Well, how do you see the Biden administration approaching the Afghanistan in terms of its policy vis-a-vis what Donald Trump has done?
Yes, I did spend a significant amount of time working closely with the National Security Council under the Obama administration, including under Secretary of Defense for Policy, Michelle Flournoy, who stands for a responsible withdrawal from Afghanistan, one that is conditions-based, and one, of course, that President Trump has also committed, as we know from his South Asia strategy, where he came out very clearly to pinpoint the safe havens in our neighborhood. It continues harboring terrorism and extremism, unfortunately, in Afghanistan, while leaving an adequate number of forces in Afghanistan to continue supporting our forces as we are leading this counter-terrorist and counter-insurgency operations in this imposed war. So there is by and large consensus, as we also know from Senator Lindsey Graham's tweets just following the statement made by the acting Secretary of Defense Miller, and as well as the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who also made a similar statement in support of staying the course in Afghanistan and pursuing a condition-based approach, one that enables the Afghan to deliver on the basic expectations and the resolutions of the Afghan lawyer Jirga, which took place before the start of the peace talks last September. And I think those expectations are to commit to a humanitarian ceasefire, and then to a permanent ceasefire, and to then continue talks to produce a negotiated political settlement within the Afghan constitutional framework. And that's the message that we will go to the Geneva conference at the end of this month, which I'm sure you would be interested in,
Sure.
more about.
Since you're talking about the neighborhood, how do you visualize the Biden administration's policy, especially towards Pakistan, since we know, all of us know that the root of the problem lies in control, in sanctuaries, in finances that come from the deep state within Pakistan?
Well, I think the president-elect knows our region quite well. He has made repeated visits. I think it's senator and the chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Even when I was serving in Washington, I used to closely work with his professional staffers who would, often meet with us to, get our views on the situation in Afghanistan. And even then, we would say that unless the safe sanctuaries, the safe havens are closed down, unless the sources that support and sponsor, terrorist activities by the Taliban in Afghanistan, it's really hard to imagine how any peace effort would actually, succeed at the end of the day. So the president-elect knows this region, and that's why he's committed to staying the course in Afghanistan and committed to a strong residual force that fights along our forces against Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and ISIS and their related networks while pursuing a sustainable peace process and outcome that which we all desire.
Ambassador, just an example of how things have not changed. The Ministry of Interior just a couple of days back, I think, put out a list of almost 150 people who had been fighters from the Taliban fighters from Pakistan who had been killed in the fight in Helmand. But again, just looking at what you mentioned earlier, that is the commitments that the Taliban made in the US-Taliban deal that was signed on 29th February this year. We don't see any movement in terms of surety that there's no link to, say, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. Many attacks take place where the Taliban denies and so-called Daesh or Islamic State takes responsibility. So this withdrawal that has been announced, even though there was a timetable, say, till spring next year that the Americans had put out in that document, the Taliban is not fulfilling its commitments. So why is America going out of its way to do that, to follow up on what they have committed?
Well, since the Taliban signed the deal with the United States, although that excluded us, and although we had a joint declaration with the United States, and under that declaration and under the United Nations Security Council resolution, the government of Afghanistan has delivered on all of our commitments, involving, of course, the representatives of the Afghan people from across the nation to actually come and even endorse the release of 400 prisoners, including 60 with war crimes and drug trafficking and so forth, all to demonstrate our compassion, our courage and commitment to the peace process, because peace is what every Afghan desires and demands, and especially our youthful population, as we've been through decades and decades of imposed conflicts. Clearly, yes, the Taliban, as you said, have faltered and failed to deliver on their commitment to reduce violence and, of course, to initiate a ceasefire as a confidence building measure on both sides, so that we could carry on the talk to produce a sustainable outcome, so that this war is wrapped up, and that assistance from that point on would focus on development and reconstruction and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, they have not done so, and they have basically reacted to these announcements as a way to escalate as opposed to de-escalate violence across Afghanistan. And so that's why it's important that we stay the course and engaged and involved in Afghanistan, so that together we see this mission possible. What I say, mission possible through, it's very possible to win this war for peace and justice and democracy and the liberty and freedoms the Afghan people have achieved over the past 19 years.
Mr. Adri, you were talking about the Republic's negotiating team with the Taliban. Now, the talks there have completely stalled, and we believe it's over rules and procedures. It's not even got to any substantial discussion as yet. Many would say that is also because the Taliban is utilizing the fact that the Republic's team is so varied that it's seen as not unified like the Taliban is in negotiation.
Well, they're very unified and united, actually. They're all seeking one end state in Afghanistan, and that's
Peace.
yes, peace through ensuring a sovereign, united, democratic Afghanistan that is, at peace in itself and the world. And I think what matters is that inclusive team, because we're, a democracy, it includes all voices, including women, to ensure that we achieve a sustainable outcome, one that would actually, address the concerns and desires and demands of the Afghan people who came together before the start of the talks and endorsed this process, including, authorized us to release the prisoners as a concession in order to make a meaningful and genuine start towards results.
Oh, you talked about the donor conference at the end of this month, and there are apparently some conditions that have been laid out, which would be interesting to see how that pans out, because it's not just talks with the Taliban, it's or troop withdrawal that really matters to the situation in Afghanistan. Is also the money that will help in development. But just looking at your personal experience in Colombo, and we've seen Sri Lanka itself dealing with terrorism. We saw how they dealt with the LTTE. Tell us a little bit more of how Sri Lanka and Afghanistan could collaborate or learn from their experiences.
Yes, our relations with Sri Lanka have continued to grow, as you may have seen the recent high-level exchange of messages between our two leaderships, marking the 62nd anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between our two countries. There is much that we can learn from Sri Lanka's war to peace transition, especially their decisiveness in the fight against terrorism. And so we are looking forward to signing a bilateral defense cooperation MOU with Sri Lanka in order to exchange expertise and experience in the fight against insurgency and terrorism, drug trafficking, and other criminal activities that harm, of course, both sides and destabilize regional security, and as well as even maritime security, because what happens in Afghanistan directly impacts maritime security in the Indian Ocean region. And so we look forward to doing more, of course, but unfortunately this pandemic has preoccupied everyone and has disabled both sides and everyone from traveling and doing the things we need to do to make things happen. But we have signed several MOUs and agreements with Sri Lanka, which we have started implementing, and there are a number of MOUs and agreements, including a defense cooperation one in the pipeline to be signed as soon as travel restrictions have eased.
It's interesting you mentioned anti-drug trafficking, and Admiral Silva, who is the ambassador designate to Kabul from Sri Lanka, has a lot of experience in that. But just talking about connectivity now, you're also working on a direct flight between Colombo and Kabul. You yourself and your exemplary work in Colombo in Sri Lanka has been welcomed in the Walesi Jirga by the Foreign Minister Hanif Atmar. But connectivity now, especially during this pandemic, the air corridors were kept open or have increased, and especially India and Afghanistan have really benefited from that. Tell us a little bit more about how you visualize connectivity increasing.
Yes, connectivity is at the heart of the Afghan foreign policy, because we're pursuing a win-win policy towards all of our near and far neighbors, including Sri Lanka, because it's through connectivity that we can bring our two nations closer together through business and investment, education, higher education, and increase people-to-people ties and contacts, and including cultural cooperation. So had not been for the COVID, I think we would have already had a direct flight between Kabul and Colombo by now, since His Excellency President Gotabaya Rajapaksa is firmly committed. And when I last met him with our former Minister of Finance, he had immediately placed a call with the chairman and the CEO of the Sri Lankan Airlines to discuss with me the possibility of starting such a flight as soon as possible. And we did have a very productive meeting, and it almost happened, but unfortunately, given the COVID, it has now been postponed, but we look forward to pursuing this. As this happens, of course, we have recently signed a cooperation MOU between the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce of Sri Lanka and the Afghanistan Chamber of Commerce and Investment, bringing both sides' businesses to discuss their export products, especially from Afghanistan, our fresh fruits, dried nuts, which have reached all markets across India, and equally Sri Lanka. We'd love to have a share of our pomegranates and dried nuts, such as almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and so forth. And from here, much like India, I'm sure as imported Sri Lankan tea and Ceylon tea, as much as we import from other countries, as you know, from your time in Afghanistan, we are a tea drinking nation. We drink lots of tea, but we produce none. And so there are many products in which we're interested in importing from Sri Lanka. And of course, aside from tourism and medical tourism and higher education tourism, areas that we are doing much business with India. And so there is space for extending that to Sri Lanka. So in light of this, we have focused on connectivity via land and sea and air, and especially the air corridor, which has already been extended to India. We'd like to further extend that across from Mumbai to Sri Lanka. So right now the SpiceJet is operating, I think, but we can extend that to Sri Lanka until the direct flight starts.
Ambassador Hydari, I really appreciate your time and hope to see you in person soon once the circumstances allow it.
Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to catching up with you. Thank you.